In what ways is religion both a system of meaning and a system of power? As we said at the beginning of this chapter, we cannot talk about religion without talking about power. Power is negotiated throughout all cultural systems, and perhaps even more within religious systems. Religion is also a system that provides explicit meaning to many people in their daily lives. We have to consider our understanding of religion between its meaning and its use as a system of power. For Durkheim, the core symbol among Australian Aborigines was the totem, usually an animal, which represented the social group itself, which was named after the totem. Totemism thus constituted a system of meaning and a powerful means of forging group solidarity. For Geertz, the meaning of symbols, as well as symbolic acts, create the cultural system of a religion. In Christianity, the core symbol is the cross, which obviously symbolizes the death of Christ, but also his sacrifice, which absolves us of sin and leads believers toward the afterlife. Can you imagine the last 20 centuries in Europe or the history of this country without the cross? Jehovah's Witnesses do not reject Christ, but they reject the cross as a pagan symbol. Note that in most Christian churches, arguing that Christ had been crucified on a stake would be considered heterodox. We have again to balance our understanding of religion between its meaning and its use as a system of power. Anthropologist Talal Asad objects to Geertz's explanation of religion. For Asad, it is not enough that we simply accept symbols as imbued with meaning. Asad asks, where did this meaning come from, and how was it established as canonical? How was it authorized? Asad argues that the meanings behind religious symbols were produced through a complex historical process, through which meanings were created, contested, and maintained. In other words, processes rife with power and contention. It is very important always to remember the dynamics of both power and meaning when we approach religion. Let's now turn to examples of how meaning and power can intertwine in religion, blurring the boundaries between them. Let's touch briefly on the relation between missionaries and colonialism. Here, we see a painting by Haitian artist P.L. Richet that shows enslaved Africans disembarking in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, today Haiti. Saint-Domingue was a wealthy French sugar colony in which massive numbers of slaves imported from Africa toiled and died. In the foreground, a sinister-looking priest holds a cross. Here, religion is coupled with a powerful system of oppression. Now let's turn to the Taliban. The Taliban is an Islamic fundamentalist group that ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, when a US-led invasion toppled the regime for providing refuge to al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. The Taliban was formed in the early 1990s by an Afghan faction of the Mujahideen, Islamic fighters who had resisted the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989 with the covert backing of the US Central Intelligence Agency and Pakistani intelligence services. They were joined by younger Pashtun tribesmen who studied in Pakistani madrasas or seminaries. Taliban is Pashto for students. These seminaries were mostly financed by Saudi Arabians who supported a hardline form of Sunni Islam. The movement attracted popular support in the initial post-Soviet era by promising stability and rule of law after conflict in the early 1990s among rival Mujahideen groups. The Taliban entered Kandahar in November 1994 to pacify the crime-ridden southern city, and in September 1996 seized the capital, Kabul. The Taliban sought to create a Muslim state, restore peace and security, and enforce their own austere version of Sharia or Islamic law. In areas it controlled, the Taliban imposed its brand of justice. The regime neglected social services and other basic state functions, even as its Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice enforced prohibitions on behavior labeled un-Islamic. It required women to wear the head-to-toe burqa, banned music, television, and kite flying, and jailed men whose beards were judged too short. The Taliban also carried out public executions of convicted murderers and adulterers and amputations of those found guilty of theft. After the Taliban took control of Afghanistan in 1996, women's status declined rapidly until they were largely confined to home, only being allowed out with a male escort. Most girls were barred from school, and few women were allowed to work outside the home. Universities continued to function, but girls were absent from all faculties except medicine. Women received beatings if their burqas were considered too short or if any skin showed. These rules made life unbearable for women who no longer had a living male relative, many of whom were killed during the years of fighting, or for women too poor to afford a burqa. Windows in homes had to be painted to prevent others from viewing women from the outside. Women could not laugh, talk loudly, or make any noise in public. The Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice patrolled the streets looking for those who strayed outside the narrow confines of their laws. After it lost power in 2001, the Taliban regrouped across the border in Pakistan. Today it leads an insurgency against the Western-backed government in Kabul. Its supporters, fighting in the name of Islam against Western oppression, are considered participants in a liberation movement. And this last point gets then at this relationship between religion and power. From one perspective, we can see the Taliban as liberators, right, providing stability, but from another perspective, they're also oppressors. Let's look at a case of religion, power, and resistance in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. What is your image of a Buddhist monk? A quiet, meditating man in flowing robes? Men living by a doctrine of nonviolence and peace? Men who refuse to eat meat due to the violence of killing animals for food? What about leading protests and marching in the streets to overthrow a government? In 2007, thousands of monks took to the streets of Myanmar's capital city. For decades, the country had endured a violent and repressive military government. In 2007, the government raised fuel prices by 500%. The cost of fuel can have a profound effect on an economy. Anyone that needs to be transported to a store or market uses fuel to get there. Thus, when fuel prices went up by 500%, prices on virtually all goods, everything from eggs to cooking oil, also rose drastically. In a nation where the majority of citizens live in poverty, this was a big problem. The nation's population took to the streets in protest. They quickly found that they were no match for the government's military power. Protesters were beaten back by the military, and the government nearly succeeded in quelling resistance. But then they made a fatal mistake. The military shot and beat several Buddhist monks. Myanmar's population is deeply religious, and Buddhist monks are considered among the most sacred people in the nation. The physical assault on the monks reinvigorated the protests against the government. Thousands of the nation's monks took to the streets to join the protests. They marched in the streets flanked by thousands of citizens who were willing to bodily protect these monks. In the end, The 2007 protest was just one of many, and by 2011, the military junta that had controlled the country for decades was officially dissolved. The nation still has many troubles to resolve, but the monks had their say, and the military rule is gone. For religious men and women devoted to peace and tranquility, this is a tremendous display of political power. In 2015 parliamentary elections, the National League for Democracy, NDL, won in a landslide victory and will choose Myanmar's next president. Now let's turn to religion and revolution in Mexico, as shown in events that occurred in the 1990s in Chiapas. The people living in the state of Chiapas are among the poorest in all of Mexico. However, the state sits on abundant national resources, including oil, natural gas, and hydraulic power. Unfortunately, a majority of the profits from these industries leave the state. Fed up with the repressive economic conditions, a group of local residents led a coordinated march in 4 cities throughout the state on January 1st, 1994. This group became known as the Zapatistas. They advocated for economic equality for the people of Chiapas. The Mexican government quickly blamed Samuel Ruiz Garcia, a cardinal in the Catholic Church of Chiapas, for inciting rebellion. This was an extraordinary step, since even today, approximately 90% of all Mexicans identify as Catholic. Publicly blaming a Catholic cardinal was a dangerous thing for the government to do in a country where the Church has such widespread support. Indeed, the Zapatistas movement continued for many more years after the initial protests, despite the government's attempts to crack down on it. We might ask, though, why did the government blame the cardinal? Was there any truth to the charge? To provide context, we need to turn to the Catholic reforms known as Vatican II. In 1959, Pope John XXIII called for a Vatican Council to modernize the Catholic Church. This was a major event in the history of the Catholic Church and became known as Vatican II. The Council called for many radical changes, including the abolishment of the Latin Mass in favor of the Mass being performed in local languages. In general, these reforms were aimed at making the Church more friendly to its members and improving the Church's involvement with people's daily lives, rather than simply expecting them to attend Mass once a week in a language they did not understand. Having attended Vatican II, Cardinal Ruiz Garcia returned to Chiapas and began to work to implement its message of openness and support for the people. In particular, the Cardinal placed emphasis on training catechists, that is, lay teachers for the Church. Catechists weren't professional teachers, but community members seeking to become more involved in the Church. The Cardinal dictated that catechist training should take a high priority, and that issues of community life and social needs should be given just as much attention as church doctrine and scripture. The program was highly successful, and the state went from having just 700 catechists in 1960 to over 8,000 by the time of the Zapatista revolt. Cardinal Ruiz Garcia did not organize or support the Zapatistas, but the message being spread by the Cardinal's catechists was a message of the importance of community life and social needs. This message mirrored Zapatista calls for social justice. Did the Cardinal lead or conspire with the rebellion? No. However, his policies did build community interest in the issues of social justice that spurred the revolution. Here we see how the Cardinal's efforts to make the religious life more meaningful in the communities he served was also related to power relations.